afterwards too.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming to Sigstore office hours. We actually have no agenda for today other than the sort of standard one. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to move intros from the very end of the meeting to the very beginning of the meeting, because that sounds like a more appropriate time to do that to me. We'd love to hear folks introduce themselves, especially if it's your first time, but also if you just know you're gonna have questions to ask today. I'll start. I'm Zach. I'm a software engineer / researcher at ChainGuard, and I think Sigstore is pretty cool. So I'm really excited to be here and talk about it. And in this meeting, we do a mix of stuff. Sometimes we have really cool demos to show off. Nobody has signed up to do that today. But it's also a great open forum for questions of the form. I'm brand new to Sigstore. Can it do X? Or we're trying to incorporate this into my company. How do I do that? Or I'm trying to achieve this abstract software supply chain security property. I don't know if Sigstore is appropriate or not, but it's interesting to talk about. All of that is sort of totally in scope. So feel free to drop stuff on the agenda, but we can just also do open floor at some point. But first, anyone else wanna do a quick introduction of themselves? Yeah, Fabian.
I don't know how polite we need to be with the raising hands. Hi, Fabian. I'm a security engineer at Edgeless Systems, mainly doing confidential computing stuff and using Sigstore ecosystem to securely distribute our artifacts and metadata. Yeah, I joined today because I have 1 or 2 questions regarding GA and maybe threat model, but we can come to that in a bit.
Great. Aaron?
Yeah, sorry, I had to find unmute. Yeah, I'm Aaron Friedel. I am an engineer at Pulumi, and I'm interested in Sigstore and supply chain security ecosystem for securing our provider and plugin ecosystem.
Awesome. I would be super excited to talk about that. I think a lot of folks in the room would too, but one of the things I'm most excited about in Sigstore is sort of its use in securing package repositories. And I think, plugin systems for something like Pulumi certainly qualifies. And I know for a fact, William and Zach on the call, along with actually many of the folks on this call have that same interest. So I'm gonna, if that's okay, just add an item for you to the open floor, and we can just talk about where you're at with that. Anyone else want to do an intro, or should we jump into?
I'll briefly intro myself. I think I met a lot of you already, but so hello. But my name is William. I'm a security engineer at TrailofBits. I work with a few clients implementing Sigstore functionality, and specifically working on the Python implementation of a Sigstore client. So my interest is mostly on the client side and getting it into the hands of users, especially package management ecosystems. Yeah. So.
Cool. All right. Intros going once, going twice. All right, great. Then I think Fabian, you said you had a question about GA.
Oh yeah, so I'm preparing a live demo for a meetup on Thursday. So if anyone is in the Berlin area, you're welcome to join us. We're talking a bit about supply chain security and Kubernetes stuff. I tried to adopt our pipeline just to put it in a little demo repository. And since Sigstore is GA now, I just removed all of the cosign experimental thing and everything broke. So how silly of me to assume those go hand in hand. But yeah. just a general question. What is the roadmap? What is the timeline here? How to relate GA and this experimental flag in general?
Yep. Yeah, that's a super great question. I think your intuitions weren't totally off base. The thing blocking us from removing that cosign experimental flag from cosign was the fact that none of the infrastructure came with sort of support SLOs. And now that Sigstore infrastructure is GA, we are going to, and going to in the future tense is the key there, but going to remove the cosine experimental flag. In particular, that's going to happen with the cosine 2.0 release, just because there's enough big changes. And then there's enough, for better or for worse, we had enough like sort of semi-deprecated behavior and things that we had really needed, breaking changes we really needed to make, that we kind of have decided to all stuff into the 2.0 release. So it has slowed it down from simply turning on cosine experimental by default into, because once you did that, actually a lot of existing behaviors became inaccessible, especially if you weren't using keyless signing flows or you wanted to like selectively turn off parts of the Sigstore pipeline. And so you're going to have a slightly better cosine 2.0 experience for all of this, but it means that we're waiting a little bit on that. The timeline on that is we want to cut a release candidate. I believe the target for that is this week. And I'm going to, as soon as I'm done chatting, I'm going to drop a link to, there's a tracking issue in the cosine repo for cosine 2.0. But your intuition overall is right. That is a lot of what we're trying to do with GA, but we just, not all the pieces have come together in order for us to actually drop the requirement for that flag.
All right, exciting. I wasn't aware of version 2 being on the horizon. Are all the experimental flags related to GA, or are there some other features that are behind a separate feature gateway? What do you call them?
Currently, the answer is basically yes. But that's an accident. So the experimental flag was not designed for this specific purpose. It was designed for generally, I want to push a feature to the cosine CLI, but not commit to supporting it forever. Right now, the only things behind that flag happen to be GA related. So we're basically going to do a full reset on the cosine experimental flag where we move all the stuff that was in the experimental feature set, make it sort of stable. And then in cosine 2.0, my hunch is we will very quickly see a number of experimental features get released. And I'm also going to drop into the doc a pointer to a proposal for sort of cosine's versioning guarantees that I believe has been floating around for a month and change. And most of the cosine folks have seen it and seem okay with it. So we're going to try to make that official very soon. But roughly, the cosine versioning guarantee we're going to relax things a teeny tiny bit from sort of semantic versioning as you'd expect it. I have sort of a strong opinion that Semver is not quite right for software applications. Like that's why Chrome and Firefox are at version 6,000 or whatever they're at. And if you just bump the major version every week, like that's worse, in my opinion, than no versioning guarantees at all. So we're going to basically cut over cosine to basically Semver with deprecation periods. And those deprecation periods will last like 6 months or so, but on the CLI feature. So that's probably more information than you wanted to know, but I'll drop a
no, definitely great answer. Always interesting. Yeah. Maybe then for cosine 2.0, maybe you could use feature flags that are a bit more aptly named regarding the feature they are gating. Like just making everything experimental is kind of hard to match this to, what is holding it off, or is it here to stay?
Yes, I would love your feedback then on that document that I just
have a look.
If you have suggestions for how to do that, because I have seen folks try to experiment in the past with sort of really fine-grained feature flags where you say, okay, cosine underscore features equals X comma Y, and that's a little bit tough to keep track of. I think sort of this binary thing is about right from a semantic perspective, but we could maybe explain it better or make the discoverability better.
Makes sense.
Cool. Okay. So on that topic, anything else? Okay, great. Then in the interests of variety, well, no, I'm going to move, Aaron, I'm going to move you to the very end, just because I think it will take an arbitrary amount of time to discuss. So then I'm going to move William for the sake of variety to be the next item. So take it away.
Sure. Yeah, so this is something that I've been thinking about. I don't want to get the opinions of some of the other client developers, maintainers, etc. on. So we're currently refactoring parts of Sigstore Python to change the way we do signing verification from reading the entire input in as a blob and then doing the operation over, basically a big buffer in memory to a streaming fashion. The idea being that you might want to sign or verify arbitrarily large inputs. And one of the observations that we had is that because ECDSA has this property of all signatures are over the hash of the input rather than being over the input itself, you can just hash and then pass in the pre-hashed form to your signature generation or verification function. So what we're doing now is we're streaming in, doing the digest in chunks over the input, and then doing the signature or signature verification on that digest. So that it works. The risk with that is that you can now have these sort of like truncation attacks where if someone inadvertently uses a socket or some other like network controlled stream, you can truncate that input and potentially create either a compromised signature or a verification that should not have passed. And so I wanted to get some people's opinions on how best to mitigate that. Actually, I'll link the issue where I'm currently thinking about this.
I dropped it in.
Oh, great. Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, is it distinct from the PR that you tagged?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yep.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah. So my first intuition is just, we won't support sockets. We'll make sure that everything has a fixed size. But if people have other opinions about how best to do this, I'd like to hear them.
And to be clear, the proposed solution where we require that things have a fixed size would still allow you to stream from a file, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be required to load a file into memory.
Right. And it would also support higher application protocols like HTTP, where you do have a fixed size ahead of time.
Mhm.
It's only things like raw sockets would become unsupported. So like possibly not a big deal at all.
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to take advantage of the crowd in this meeting and ask, hearing that, is anyone intending to sign things using Sigstore first that aren't just files or blobs that you already have in memory? Like at all? Like, is anyone intending to like make an HTTP request and feed the response into a sign call?
Yeah, it's very possible this is not a use case that even matters remotely. This is more like a falling out consequence of how generic Python is.
Even
Yeah,
if I'm
sorry.
I was going to say, even if I understand correctly, an HTTP request would actually work if it had a content length header. It would be some other sort of network request where you didn't necessarily know the entire size ahead of time.
Yeah, like a like if the response was transfer encoding chunked.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But even in that case, in the sort of truncation attack, there would still have to be a valid signature for the truncated message, right?
Yeah, assuming transport security. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Which is probably a reasonable assumption. I think,
Right. This is, the omniscient attacker, can trick you into signing some prefix of what you had intended to sign.
Yeah. The more reasonable attack here might be something like you build a package and push it to a CDN and tell me to download it later to sign it. And so as you download it, the CDN, which has become malicious, truncates. And because they control the transport layer, they can legitimately truncate the connection. So that's the threat model.
Yeah, I like that plan. I think that's a reasonable compromise, and anyone whose needs are not met by it. It's in the notes doc, Tyson. Thanks for asking, but I'll drop it in the chat as well. It's, I think, on this PR here.
Yep, that's it.
And then another link to the notes doc in the chat. Yeah, I think if someone's needs are not met by the solution you mentioned, then they can argue why it's important. and we can think about exposing an additional API. I think I'm okay, honestly, with your first proposal of just declaring this as sort of like a caveat emptor situation where, you know, if you're doing something that funky anyway, I'm not so worried. But I like what you're but it seems like you have an easy way to make it hard to hold wrong that isn't going to preclude any typical behaviors, so we might as well. So that sounds great to me. Do you want to follow up in maybe the clients channel on Slack and just point other folks besides, because I saw it for cosign, and I think it does not affect cosign. We're just passing only, well, it does not, yeah, yes. Oh, I think it's okay in cosign right now. Cosign has no way to like pass it in HTTPS URL, and all the Docker stuff we're doing, we're finishing the downloads before we're signing. But for the other clients, I think that's a nice design point, and you should just point to that, and it seems like your resolution is quite reasonable.
Cool, we'll do.
Cool. All right. Anything else on that? Or I guess then, Fabian, you had another question?
Yeah, so I was working with some other tools from the ecosystem. So Co, for example, is able to generate a container image for your Go application, and it directly pushes it to a remote registry. And then it has an additional flag to print out basically all the images that it pushed. And then the documentation basically proposes to use that file to then run it through cosign to also sign all these images. I'm curious if this is in line with the general threat model, that you just give the image away and then download it back, or just use the same one you have locally, because there's this disconnect, right? You could be attacked on the way when it's in the registry, the transport layer. And maybe also in the same spirit, when I have a GitHub action or something similar, a pipeline that is split up, and I generate an artifact, then I push it somewhere to just download it later and sign it. Is this a weaker threat model? Should I just sign as soon as I have generated the artifact, or is this out of scope?
Yeah, so there's a couple things going on here. First is we are pushing very hard to make it so that when folks sign OCI artifacts, they are telling us the SHA of the OCI artifact. That is sort of behavior that warns now, and one of the 2.0 tracking issues, or one of the 2.0 blocker issues, is to basically turn that warning into an error. And the Co, like using Co in this manner, attempts to follow that, or follows the letter of that requirement, though perhaps not the spirit. What makes this really tricky is that it is possible that you don't actually know the SHA of the thing that you push until you push it. Like the content of your, and I'm not an OCI expert, so I invite anyone who knows more about OCI than me to fill in the blanks. But I think in OCI, you actually, the hash depends on things like where in the registry it winds up, or like what the hashes of the layers that it depends on happen to be. And consequently, Co cannot predict the hash before it pushes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Brandon, you're on the call. That's great. Can you?
I thought you were like pinging my
Correct me.
name there in the whole time there. It's going to depend on the digest of all the layers you're pushing, and it also depends on how you format the manifest itself. It's JSON. You can reformat JSON a dozen different ways and have the exact same content in there.
Got it. So are there circumstances, Brandon, I'm glad you're here, while we have you, there are circumstances, it sounds like, under which you don't have to do this round trip before you know that the SHA.
Yeah, depending on the tool that's doing the push, that tool can generate that manifest in advance and tell you, I'm going to have exactly this one digest. So depending on how you're sending it, you can do that.
In a circumstance like Co, are you familiar with that tool?
Co probably will work because it can do reproducible. If you do it with like a Docker build, it's not. But if you did a Docker build X and output to an OCI layout, you're generating the manifest at that point. So there's, like I say, all the different builders out there do it differently. I don't know the internals of code and know if you can get that digest out of it before it pushes or not.
But in theory, it seems like perhaps you could. It sounds like great. So then that's super helpful context. Yeah. So I think you cannot. So if in summary, it sounds like you cannot always predict the hash of the thing you're pushing to the registry before you push it. Under some circumstances, you can. In those circumstances, we should prefer that the local builder tool prints the hash then. But that does raise sort of a question. I think the point you're making, Fabian, is a good one, which is, yes, let's try to only sign things that we actually make ourselves, and don't get from a third party. And so to that end, I would invite brainstorming from you or from anyone else on the call about whether this is just an education thing, whether this is something where we should go file a bunch of bugs about all the upstream tools that folks are using to generate containers and other artifacts and then sign, or whether there's something from a UX, there's a UX lever we have to kind of make it more explicit what's going on in those circumstances.
I did have a talk a while back at Open Source Summit back in Austin where I was hitting a little bit on this issue where it would be nice if a lot more tooling supported outputting to the OCI layout format, which is an on-disk syntax before you've even pushed it to the registry. And if we did that, then you could say, sign this thing in the OCI layout that's local on my drive, and then push the whole thing in one big unit. But the tooling is just not quite there yet. The format's there, it's just the support for it.
Interesting. So that's really helpful. I'm gonna drop a link to that video. Do you think there's anything we could do where so if someone's giving us a SHA, would we ever be able to tell whether whether the SHA had come from from the registry?
The place that this would be handy in cosign, and you did get a shout out in this talk, is if cosign itself could sign directly in the layout, because the layout is just a directory structure, file and directory structure on disk. And so if you could say sign this tag within this local disk directory here, and it actually push that signature into that location.
Okay, I'm going to give myself an AI to file an issue about that, unless you think there is one already.
I don't know if there is one. I haven't looked.
Is it possible to also include this information in the signature or maybe in the attestation that, yeah, I've generated this locally and used it locally, or that I just downloaded it beforehand from this source and then I signed whatever I received from this source? Because this, to me, feels like a different threat model again.
Yeah, what we ran into, one of the other comments that I had from that one was, if you start signing stuff that's local on your disk, one of the things that cosign attaches is what I signed. So it says, here's the image name up on a registry or something like that. If you're signing something local, it's potentially going to be localhost if you had a little local registry spinning up just on top of this thing, or it's going to be some internal thing. So it might be nice if cosign was a little bit more flexible for you to input, here's what I'm signing, and here are the names that I expect this to show up as for users to see publicly, so that it's useful. I understand the concern with something like that with threat modeling, but at the same time, you're trusting the key of the signer at that point. And so it's, do you trust the signer to tell you where they're pushing this image to?
Yeah, I think the story here is, in general, whenever I can make the statement that you should infer from a signature as narrow as possible, let's do that. So like, I built this image on my desktop is kind of what you're often saying, and that's better as a statement or claim than I built this image on my desktop and then round tripped it to a third party, and that's what I'm signing. So yeah I think, do we, I'll get, one second, Aaron. Brandon, quick question. Do you think it's a good idea to include the name of the image that you're signing? It feels like yes, right? In the signature or in the payload?
I understand why Cosign wants to have the name in there. I just think if you're going to have that in there, and it's more of an informational piece of detail, and so it might be nice if it was more controllable by the signer to say, here's what it's going to be as, because I think there are a lot of scenarios out there where people sign stuff on an internal registry and then push the whole image to a public registry later on, and they don't even want the internal registry in there in the first place. And so I think there's some use cases in there where it'd be more helpful if the signer could say, this is what the end user should expect when they start to pull this later on.
Great, thanks. Aaron?
Yeah, I was going to ask, because my understanding of OCI layout is that it only pushes a single manifest and a collection of blobs. Is that right? Right? Those blobs can be manifests, but only one reference is created, right?
So the top level manifest is an index, and you can treat that almost like a repository at that point. So it's got a list of tags within there. And so you can individually reference multiple tags or multiple manifests by digest. So it's most equivalent to a whole repository, but most implementations out there only support a single image within a layout. So it depends on your implementation too.
Yeah, I was curious because you mentioned essentially adding the signature directly to the OCI layout, and that seems to, my understanding is that with like the ORAS folks who are looking at implementing things like refers, you'd want to push potentially a second reference as opposed to embedding the signature directly in the OCI index. You'd have a reference to it, and of course maybe a reference to each because you might have multiple images, reference to each image.
I was working on the OCI reference spec that they were pushing on their side. They're adopting right now, and you can push both of those in there because it gets represented as a tag, so you can push both of those into the same layout. It's just a question of does tooling that use this stuff recognize it? And there, like I say, there are a bunch of tools out there that once they see more than one thing in there, they just throw up their hands and say, we don't know what to do with it. But that's an issue with the tooling. It's not an issue with the spec.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering my question.
Yep.
Okay, so then my proposal is, I'm really glad you bring this pattern up, Fabian, because I kind of have seen the workflow work, and it never even occurred to me that that's what was happening under the hood. Though in retrospect, it makes a ton of sense. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'll file a couple of issues. One is sort of about the formats that Brendan was bringing up just now, and another issue is sort of a general tracking bug for this kind of problem. From there, we will perhaps spam a number of projects, and I know, for instance, Co is going to be pretty friendly to requests here, but you know, spam some projects about with bugs upstream about trying to have them generate layouts and output those hashes first. Yeah, and I think maybe some documentation as well of just writing up this issue, and then, but that's all I can think to do.
Yeah. No, it was already good to have this discussion and get the feedback that I'm not totally wrong here, and that this is something we should think about. I'm happy to chime in and help out with, I don't know, documentation on how I'm using it and what are my concerns. And of course, feedback is welcome.
Awesome. Well, I'll CC you in on any of those. All right. Anything else kind of in that vein? I guess I can make a meta point about sort of a threat model, and which is to say, I know this is something William's invested in and Marina on the call is invested in, and I'm sure a few other folks as well, but it's a back burner project for many of us to kind of write up a little bit more formally what we think of the Sigstore threat model as being. It's actually relatively easy to do narrowly when we say, Sigstore is just a primitive you can use to sign stuff and link against OIDC identities or whatever. And it's much, much trickier to sort of do that for actual use cases like container signing and so on. And so I think there is something, a little half baked on the Sigstore website right now. There's some miscellaneous discussion that looks vaguely threat model-y here and there, but that's an initiative that, again, I think has been pretty back burner for a lot of folks, but hopefully we'll devote cycles to at some point. And I'm sure there's going to be noise in Slack about it if that's an effort you're gonna get into.
I don't think it's a super big issue because folks are super helpful when you actually do have questions about this. So I asked similar questions about Git Science threat model the other day, and Billy and Jason, sorry, were super helpful on discussing the topic. Like, what is the trade-off between like developer experience and the security Git Sign is going for? I'm not sure how many folks are actually asking these detailed questions.
Yeah, but I don't want to pat myself or Billy or Jason on the back too much, right? I think it's nice that we can answer your questions when you have them. Would be much better if all this stuff were written down, and you can still ask the questions, and then we'll just point you at something instead. So, but thank you for being understanding and patient. Cool. All right, then I want to make one final call for miscellaneous items because I think we'll probably spend the remaining time on Aaron's question about Pulumi plugins. So I guess going once, going twice. All right, Aaron, you wanna give us the spiel?
Yeah, I guess I think I already said at the beginning. Pulumi is looking at addressing supply chain security on the infrastructure as code side. So for folks not familiar with Pulumi's execution model, we have a core engine that is a binary, and that engine then interfaces with a pretty large ecosystem of plugins, most of which authored by Pulumi currently. We're looking to expand that into community-authored plugins, and that poses, as those are binaries that potentially run on a CI executor, we want to be able to attest to the origin and authenticity of those plugins. So I'm currently doing some exploration of using OCI, of using ORAS, of using Sigstore, and sort of building a comprehensive story for us to be able to distribute and sign, and potentially also do things like publish SBOMs in an OCI registry, things like that for our plugins. Is that a pretty good summary of it? I lost anyone along the way there? Awesome. I did have, I think I had two questions specific to, I think, this group, and then I guess after that, maybe open it up to any other questions people might have about how we're looking at things, because I'm sure any questions you folks might ask are probably things that I should be thinking about. The first tactical question is, when using cosign sign blob with the experimental mode, I get a .sig file, which is a pretty small file, but then when I try to verify that, I often fail to look it up in the tlog. And so I'm curious, should we, practically speaking, always be generating and accompanying our files with bundles, or is it okay if we're expecting the client to always be online to, say, acquire a plugin to publish the SIG, and maybe I'm doing something wrong with that .sig file?
Yep. So I guess I'll turn that question back around for you and ask. So a .sig file is nice because it's just small. It's tens, hundreds of bytes at most. The bundles shouldn't be much longer, but that's more like maybe a couple K, I guess. And sorry, there's some ambiguity around the term bundle. There's bundle as practiced in cosign today, which is sort of an accident of how we're storing stuff in OCI. There is sort of a new planned bundle format, which is spec'd out, and we're experimenting with it in less critical, and I don't mean that in any way as an insult, but sort of less load-bearing Sigstore clients. And so the plan there roughly is in the medium term, so order of hopefully a couple months, that spec is going to be for a bundle format is basically just going to evolve to contain the signature plus everything else you would need to verify the signature. So
think that is the bundle we're using, because we're using Cosign Experimental and outputting the bundle on SignBlob. We're using the -- bundle. Is that a different bundle?
That is the bundle. We need better disambiguation. The problem is they took the term bundle is the right term, and they took it earlier and used it for something else. So the bundle that you're referring to is basically like all the stuff that gets crammed into OCI to be used after the fact in verifying an artifact. And so the -- bundle flag just takes the stuff we would have crammed into OCI and prints it out on disk, and we can use that. It serves mostly a similar purpose, but the newer format is designed basically to enable offline verification in almost every circumstance. True air gaps are a little bit subtle there, but offline verification most of the time. My recommendation from a sort of availability perspective is to prefer sort of offline first verification flows. I don't think like that's sort of we're modeling this off of Web PKI, right? And so the transparency services in Web PKI, when they spec'd them out initially, they were all enthusiastic about doing online lookups, and then they actually tried experimenting with real clients, and the load became sort of unbearable. And so I think from a Sigstore ecosystem perspective, that's kind of the direction we're pushing people into, is offline by default, with sort of backup option of for additional checks to do that online check. The bundle that you -- bundle produces should be basically sufficient right now, but the newer format will supersede that, and we'll maintain backwards compatibility in Cosign likely for a pretty long time.
Okay. Yeah, I think for our model, online first is probably sufficient for us, as clients download a plugin once and unpack it, and so we typically don't want to store both like the tarball and the unpacked plugin. So there's not something to necessarily verify against later, and the signature checking would then occur immediately after download.
Yeah, can I ask one quick follow-up,
Yeah.
Aaron? Which is, would you be interested in a format, so it's sort of an envelope format that let you check things not while they're tarred up? So after unpacking, you would be able to go and look at the tree of files, or do you think just doing the stuff as you install it is basically giving you what you want?
Yeah, I mean, if we could integrate an envelope format that would allow us to verify at any point post download. So, for example, if you did a Plumi plugin LS, we could check the signatures offline very quickly. That would be nice. I wasn't aware that there was something available for that.
No, proposed.
Got it.
But
okay.
I'm gonna drop you an issue. I'll drop an issue in the link, and if you want to chime in and say, talk a little bit about your potential use case, that would be really helpful.
Sure.
So give me a second. While I'm doing that, Zach,
I think you're muted.
Sorry. I was saying, hopefully I don't reveal too much of my ignorance, not just by not knowing how to unmute, but also in terms of validating signatures. So and I'm not sure I'm even using the right terminology here, but you get a signing certificate back from Fulcio. And is my understanding that generally we wanted package managers to store that information alongside the package. And then the clients, when they're doing the verification, they're getting that signing certificate if it's in a bundle or whatever sort of, if it has an envelope around it. And then they're checking to make sure that that certificate kind of chains up to Fulcio's root, but they're not actually going back to like Requer for like every single like client command line, call. And so it's sort of, even when we're talking about like online versus offline, there's sort of the notion of like you're getting that signing information from your package manager versus Fulcio, and then you're checking that signature with sort of like the known good public key versus like live querying Sigstore infrastructure per client install, I guess.
Yeah, so there's a lot of subtleties, unfortunately, in the term online versus offline verification doesn't quite capture it. I think you've got most of the components. Yeah, so roughly there's the sort of identity package of stuff, which you get from Fulcio, which is a certificate basically. There's the signature, and then there's sort of metadata and timestamp information from Recor. And to complicate things further, pretty soon we're going to allow timestamp authorities as an alternative to Recor. And so the policy that we're going to have in place by default is going to look roughly like you want all of the above. You need sort of a signature from Fulcio. You check that against Fulcio's root key. You check that that certificate is in the certificate transparency log associated with Fulcio, but you do that by default as an offline check. So that is checking what's called the SCT, the signed certificate timestamp. And then for Recor, we're going to do exactly the same thing. You check that the Recor thing is signed by Recor and inside the Recor transparency log. And that's a check done by default. That's going to be offline, but it could be online where you actually go hit Recor and you say, hey, give me a proof that this is in the current log. And then there's the signature, which doesn't have an online component. And then there's the TSA is going to have a similar story to both Fulcio and Recor there. And then there's, even if you want to do all this stuff offline, you have to get the known good public keys in the first place. That you do using Tough is how we're distributing those keys. And that's typically an online check, even for quote unquote offline verification. And there's some folks who want to do this in an air gap setting where it has to be offline. So there's some work on basically being able to staple the known good public keys to everything else in such a way that you don't just trust those without verifying them. You actually check that the known good public keys chain up to the sort of root of trust that you're shipping with Cosign. So I probably lost everyone in there, but there's a lot going on. We are hoping to have the story we expose certainly to end users and hopefully to, I guess, middle users, which is most of you all, be a little bit simpler and have kind of a nicer way to visualize that or whatever. But those are all the moving parts. Okay, glad. Cool.
The complexity here is also why we need a threat model. It's very difficult to understand all the moving parts without understanding which you need for which specific properties.
I think that question by Zach also segues into my second question. So if we want to move on to my second question, we can. So speaking of then OCI artifacts, and I guess touching on this concept of both envelopes and publishing collections of SHAs, there's several different levels of things that can be signed, right? Like theoretically, I could sign every SHA that I'm pushing. I could sign just the index, which at least signs all of the SHAs that are pointed to in that index. And of course, I could sign just maybe the tarballs and push those, or I could potentially sign something inside the tarballs, which is the envelope. How are we thinking about this in terms of what level of this goes to the threat modeling as well as what sort of level of signature verification is there like a best practice here? I think the ORAS folks are pushing for, say, each individual artifact or blob to be signed. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, Brandon?
I don't think you want to sign each individual blob, but you probably want to sign each individual manifest. And so
Okay.
and the reason is because people can deploy an individual manifest and say, I want to deploy this one specific digest. You still want to be able to verify that. But if you have a manifest list and you're looking at everything, it's kind of nice to be able to say, is this whole list signed as well? And so that gets you 99% of the use cases out there. And then from within there, you've already signed the whole content of that manifest. All the digests are already in there and they're immutable by definition.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think with Right, because if I traverse, say, an OCI index to a image manifest, then I at least know the SHA of each image manifest, and that's been signed. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Normally, I would say you can just sign the index, you know, everything's signed, but because people can pick an individual platform-specific manifest out from that list, it's useful to have those lower levels as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I would argue that this is almost more of like a question about the semantics of your ecosystem, right? Like what is the unit of deployment, so to speak? And the thing about signing too small of something, well, I'll give you like an example that's exaggerates to make a point, right? Like if I signed the bit 0 and I signed the bit 1, right? You could sort of compose those in arbitrary ways to make whatever data you wanted. And so if like there is some plugin notion in the Pulumi ecosystem, and that's something you're going to know a lot better than any of us, that's sort of like self-contained, that is about the unit I would be interested in, or maybe even like a list. Like, yeah, you have to think about like what could go wrong if the wrong thing gets signed. And signing too much is usually okay, as long but maybe comes with some convenience costs. Signing too little opens you up to sort of like mix and match style attacks, where like maybe I give you a client at one version and a server at an incompatible version, and then they don't talk to each other right, or something like that.
That makes sense. I think, sorry, I think I said blob earlier, and I probably meant artifact, because that's a subset of blobs are maybe the artifacts in the ORAS notion. And so I think we would probably sign at the artifact level, because that is the unit of, say, download, right? You don't, if I'm on an x86 Linux machine, I only need the plugin for x86 Linux, and that would be one artifact in the manifest.
Yeah, if you've got an artifact like an SBOM pointing to an image, it's useful to be able to say this SBOM is also signed in addition to the image itself. The other thing I was going to point out, when you're running the cosign command itself, you can do a -- recursive or -r, and it'll recursively sign not only your index, but the individual platform-specific manifest all in one command.
Oh, nice. Okay, interesting. I'll take a look at that, and I'll also take a look at, I don't know if that would necessarily support the OCI artifact specification.
Probably doesn't go down to artifact. It's
very new. Yeah, I think that specification still is in RC, I believe, too.
We have not tagged it yet. We're working on it, but we have not tagged it yet.
All right. Appreciate it. I think that answers my questions. I appreciate the feedback here, and I look forward to. It's also to say I look forward to participating in future office hours and community meetings.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here. Come back anytime. I know these are only every couple weeks, and presumably you're trying to make progress in between. So holler in Slack as well. A couple other resources I might be able to point you at are, I don't know if you spend any time in the OpenSSF, but they have, and maybe I've even seen you there. The OpenSSF has a working group on securing package repositories, which tends to be a lot of folks who work on things like PyPI or NPM. But I would argue that that's exactly what you're building. And so a lot of those discussions, I think, are going to be relevant to you as well. So that could be worth checking out. William, any other thoughts on places Aaron should be looking for?
I think the OpenSSF venue is probably the biggest one. I know I'm active in there, and I think a few other people from NPM and other groups are as well. Yeah.
Would I find that forum under the CNCF Slack or another community organization?
OpenSSF.
Okay.
So if you want to just ping me on Slack and say OpenSSF repos or something like that, I will respond with pointers to their Slack and their website and so on.
Great.
Yeah. Cool.
Appreciate
but yeah, really
it.
exciting to hear. I think it's super important that when you're building such a system, I mean, you don't have to be convinced of this, but I think super important when you're building a system like the one you're working on, that, you know, we can feel pretty good about the software that your users and customers are installing is not Bitcoin miners. So
yeah, I mean, it's not just Bitcoin miners. You know, the level at which, say, somebody runs a Pulumi program is typically with extremely elevated permissions to their entire infrastructure. And so this is true of not just our tooling, but of course everyone else in this ecosystem doing CI/CD is like, we're trusted with tokens or secrets that typically provide super admin level access to everything. And it's critical that we be able to attest to the origin and at least attest to who is authoring, say, a community package that we're running on a CI system.
Agreed. And to the extent that is possible, I would love for you to share any details you have about what you're proposing. Understand, obviously, if not everything can be made public, but I think there's a bunch of subtle, I mean, again, you know this, but there's a bunch of subtle components about like, okay, sure, you have signatures from identities. How do you know who's supposed to be signing each individual plugin and so on? And I think we have reasonable answers to most of these questions, but I haven't seen them all put together in one place. So that's largely because most of these package repositories sort of weren't built from the ground. Like their sort of security initiatives were very bolt-on. And so I don't know how entrenched the stuff that you're working with is in terms of that, but like you might be able to move a little bit faster and pull together more of these components.
Yeah, I think that's what we're hoping for. Is we're looking to build something from the ground up using, something like with OCI as the base layer and build on top of that.
Yeah, you may be interested also in checking in with there are folks who are interested in I think they call it WARG, which is a terrible name, but WebAssembly Registry, which is same idea. They're planning on having some repository for WASM modules and want to build it ground up with security in mind. And so a lot of these principles too. If you would like, again, just send me a DM on Slack and I can try to facilitate an introduction there. Cool. All right. Well, keep coming. This was a lot of fun having this conversation. And thanks everyone for participating. Thanks, Fabian, for raising some great points. Thank Brandon for being the OCI expert. Thanks, Zach, for, again, asking really good questions that we should have better answers to. And thanks, William, for important feedback on how the clients are going to come together. And I think, William, you're gonna get the recording email. When you do that, can you drop it, link in?
Yep, I'll send it to you. Yep.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Hopefully catch you all in a week or two.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.